Cool.
Dobro jutro, good morning, guten Morgen. I'm glad to see many of you made it. You're still alive after last night, so thank you for joining us.
You're a local guy, right, originally?
I have family in the area, and they're kind of scattered all over the Balkans, yeah.
Nice. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction to your history. You worked in TV and film and sort of other media forms before you joined games, is that right?
Absolutely. I have a long and sordid past in TV and animation. Right out of school, I started on a show that probably none of you saw. It was with Lorenzo Lamas. It was called Renegade, and I was the kid that would hand him his gun for every shot. So that was my first job, and then I went to MTV Animation, and I got to learn some of my craft under the guys who did Beavis and Butthead. And then after that, we created a show at MTV, and we were just kids out of school, so we didn't know what we were doing. And surprisingly, we got an Emmy nomination, which was shocking. And as soon as we got that, they canceled our show. So then we moved to Los Angeles. We created another show called Megas XLR, which was about giant robots and stupid kids. And after that, long story short, I got pulled into a secret project that was also kind of a science fiction animation piece that I found out later would be the Clone Wars. So I got a chance to work on that. And slowly I've kind of like moved over to video games. I had a tour of duty at EA, and then some time at Riot, and now I'm at Blizzard. So I've crossed the threshold. I've played kind of in both of those ponds.
Yeah. And you were always a gamer. We spoke the other night about sort of D&D and tabletop stuff, but were you always a video gamer as well?
Absolutely. And we were chatting about kind of my history with tabletop games and video games, arcade games, and it's always been a passion, and I'm sure for everyone here, games have been a passion, but some of the seminal moments that helped form me for better and for worse were game related. I remember, and I'm going to date myself now, I remember when my father and I first saw the Atari system in a store, and it blew my mind, and this was like my first video game interaction, and it was the first multiplayer interaction because I could play with my father. And we played that game until they closed the store. We just couldn't stop playing. So there was that moment, and for myself and my generation, and now it's coming back, which is wonderful. The pen and paper RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. And I specifically remember when I first played D&D. And we played at my friend's house, and we played in his basement, and the basement had this big glass door that would open to a little forest. And we would play the game, and we'd open the door, and then we'd go out into the forest, and then we'd continue playing the game. This was before LARP or anything like that, but it became very real for me. And from then on, just all the other, when video games really kind of took hold, and losing yourself for, as I'm sure a few of us have done, days, months, years in a game, that made a huge impression on me. And I was always fascinated by the storytelling aspect as well as the gameplay, and always wanted to get into games. And it's funny, when I tried, I could never get in. I had a few interviews that went really badly. I had a phone interview for a position at Blizzard years and years ago. It went terribly. And then when I was in TV, games came calling. They're like, oh, okay, well, it looks like you know what you're doing now. Why don't you come on over? So that has been my path to games.
Yeah. Is there a lot of that kind of cross-pollination that goes on? Do the kind of the brain trusts at TV and film get raided by games very often?
It seems to be happening more and more, I've noticed. We were talking with Amy yesterday about how there is a certain viewpoint from both industries on the other industry, and that's starting to change now. We're realizing that we're kind of in this fusion state where like streaming and games and episodic narrative. They're all kind of coming together, and we're building the roadmap together. So some of those harsh separations are kind of falling down by the wayside.
And when you join Blizzard, I mean, what's the process behind jumping into a huge, well-established kind of world of lore like that? You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words written about those games. Yeah.
Terrifying. So we're lucky that we have a team of historians that help us with this, and I've found them immensely helpful. Because although I'm a Blizzard fan, I haven't played every last quest of every last game. It's kind of impossible.
Casual.
Yeah. Oh my God. Bite your tongue, sir. So we have a team of historians, and recently when I started, I've actually included them in our story rooms. So we have Sean Copeland, who's our head historian, who usually sits right next to me. So I always turn to him and go, "Hey man, can we do that? Did we ship something like that?" So it's wonderful that we have a lore check when we're breaking story, because I, as a fan of many of the IPs that I've worked on, I always feel it's heartbreaking when you break canon or you alter canon in a way without communicating it to your player base. So we try to be very cognizant of as we craft new lore, as we expand and evolve our lore, that we're doing it, respecting the previous stuff that we've shipped.
Yeah, I mean, obviously sometimes something retcon can become inevitable. That there's times when you might just have to go back and change things or reinterpret stuff like that. I mean, what's the best way to deal with that? Do you just have to be super open with it and say, "Sorry guys, this is breaking the fourth wall, but we are going to have to go back and rewrite this," or do you just try and sneak it through, or try and make a way for that mechanic to work within the narrative?
I try not to retcon anything. I try to keep things in canon as much as possible. And so far that's been working out for me and the team. I've only been there 3 years, but that's kind of our mandate, is like, can we make it work in continuity? Can we respect the things that our players hold so dear? So that's kind of my personal mission, and the team has taken it up as well.
Yeah. And when you're in such a senior position in narrative, I mean, I presume you're not sat there writing every last word of every description of every item in every game. Is it more of an editorial kind of position where you're looking at the way that the story's flowing, but you might just be looking at specific pieces of writing and making some alterations? Or are you kind of just shaping general directions of things?
It's more the latter, and it's not a one-to-one, but something that I equate it to is kind of a showrunner position for TV, where you help break the broad strokes, you help break the episodes, and then you trust your people to execute, and you check in with them every once in a while. And our process is somewhat unique in the games industry, in that we've fused I've taken the best aspects of running a D&D campaign, and running a writer's room, and then also game dev. So we have a very collaborative process. We have writers and directors and lore team members and devs, concept artists, storyboard artists. We all get into a big room and we jam together. So that way we are all kind of aligned on where we're going, and there's no grand reveals, hopefully, and there's no surprises down the road. And that process I found to be super helpful, especially because we have to move so quickly and we are working on so many different IPs that if you silo up, you're going to get in trouble later.
And Blizzard sort of excels at this art of bringing backstory to games that might not necessarily even find it naturally fits to the extent that something like Overwatch or Hearthstone, you don't necessarily need it there. If you're just going to be shooting somebody in the face for 20 minutes, you don't need to know whether they like avocado on toast or not. But adding that kind of stuff is obviously super popular, right? And it's really contributed towards the success of Overwatch, I think. Why do you think that people crave that kind of context of narrative in those kind of experiences where previously they'd enjoyed them without it?
Well, I think Overwatch is interesting, and Overwatch is one of the reasons that I actually came to Blizzard, in that you have, as you mentioned, FPS, you have a first-person shooter, but you have these animated shorts, and you have all this ancillary stuff that speaks to character and motivation and backstory, things that you cannot put in usually in a first-person shooter. And I felt that in many ways, Blizzard was taking new chances, new risks when it came to that, where they did not damage the gameplay, but they found a way to still convey story to players. And the two seem to work pretty well. And thank you for mentioning that, because that's something that we're continually trying to do, where one of our pillars, and I heard it yesterday in the keynote speech, gameplay first. So if the game isn't fun, there's no point in building worlds or story around it. And we found this wonderful balance where we get to work with game team, where they bring game mechanics to us, and then we break story together. So the two are pretty complementary and they work hand in hand. And we just want to continue aggressively to do that, support gameplay, but also gameplay kind of supporting story.
Yeah. So in that process, when you're creating a new character, say for Overwatch, what's the kind of hierarchy of design there? Do you get someone on the art team goes, okay, this is what we think they look like, and then you might start to shape their personality around that? Or is it very much mechanics-based? You're saying, right, we need another healer, or we might need another damage dealer, and then you kind of build the rest of it?
It's all of that, actually. The game team finds inspiration in different ways. Sometimes it's a piece of art, sometimes it's a need for the game, sometimes it's a kit, and they come to us and they present us with what they're passionate about, and then together we jam and we craft. Sometimes we help them with backstory, and we do sometimes these small, what we call them 2.5D animated shorts. Sometimes we do these full cinematic, pre-rendered pieces. And it's all, again, it goes back to that kind of collaborative nature. And I've found that jamming with designers and artists and storyboard folks in the room is a very unique experience, in that everyone brings a very passionate POV to the room. And sometimes they can clash, but we've created kind of this sense of trust where you find out what's really important together, and then you craft on that point. And it's been super, super exciting for me.
I mean, with something like an FPS, it kind of raises that interesting kind of disconnect of stuff. You've got all these heroes with these well fleshed out backstories, and then they're getting their legs blown off every 3 minutes, or they're dying and they're immediately resurrecting. Is there ever a kind of clash there that causes any kind of problems, or do you just allow those things to kind of exist in parallel and hope people are able to make that kind of cognitive disconnect between the two?
Absolutely, it's definitely the second, and we kind of let the game be the game, and then the things that we do kind of follow their own path, obviously supporting the game. And we found that our players seem to enjoy that as well. You can watch an animated short about May, discovering that she's on her own and she's lost her friends and she has to, overcome her fears. And it's kind of a separate experience from, playing as May or playing against May, right? Two totally different things.
Yeah, especially if there's one on each side.
Yeah.
Obviously, with some of the games you've made, particularly with Hearthstone and WoW, there's very much that shared world of stuff, and that kind of branching of that narrative is quite interesting, and I think speaks to what you were just saying there of having this kind of idea of this neutral pub where these guys who are normally trying to hack each other's limbs off just get together and play cards. But how do you kind of stop narrative bleed between those kind of pillars of IP? If you've just spent 6 months working on StarCraft, say, and you kind of got all those ideas bubbling around your head, and there's a similar narrative blueprint to it, perhaps, in terms of factions and motivations. How do you keep those separated and make sure that you're making them distinct?
That's a great question. And taking a step back, we kind of are a central hub, a central creative hub for Blizzard, and one of our producers kind of coined the term the Creative United Nations. So basically, we work with all the different dev teams, so we get to see everything that's in flight, and that helps us catch those double beats. And it happens a lot, right? Because there's always a current zeitgeist. There's certain things that, as gamers, as creative folks, that we're interested in, that we are, consuming, and it resonates with us. So often you're like, okay, so we're doing that in Warcraft. We can't do that here. Sorry, guys. But what that makes each piece stronger, because you're like, okay, there's a reason that we keep telling this story, or there's a reason that we're drawn to this particular character type. What is that reason? And then we dig a little deeper, and I felt that that's made our stories as well as our characters a lot stronger.
I guess another side of that is, particularly when you're working with something like fantasy, everything in that genre is kind of the 8th generation bastard stepchild of Tolkien, right? You can't really get away from that. Everyone knows that dwarves have Scottish accents and they drink a lot.
Why is that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably the second part. But how do you balance the need for comfort and expectation in that, right? Like nobody wants to play a game and see all of those expectations completely destroyed and have to relearn everything they know about it. Because if you're doing that, why not just create an entirely new race that, isn't an orc or a dwarf? But people want a bit of that comfort, but they also don't want that complete shortcut. They want a little bit of discovery. I think, some games like Divinity Original Sin have done it quite well. The Witcher did it quite well, adding a bit of nuance and a new twist to those kind of well-established tropes. I mean, what kind of level of balance do you look for in that?
Well, it's balance is a great term for it. It's a constant balancing act, because you are playing with tropes, you're playing with conventions, you're playing with things that are familiar, but there's a reason for those tropes and conventions and familiarity. There's something that we as storytellers and we as human beings are drawn to. So you try to find what those core aspects are, those pure aspects. Why is it that we always associate elves with nature? There's something there, right? Is it the fact that we as human beings are drawn to nature and we realize that that is something that's elemental to us, as opposed to, mechanical things and buildings, etc. So we do those deep dives, and then we try to mine those aspects. So always trying to push a little bit, always trying to evolve, so you don't see what you've seen so many times before that you get tired and you disconnect. And then add to that a level of human emotion, something that you can connect to, even if it is a trope, even if you've seen this story before. What can we do that actually moves you, that makes you cry? We're playing with pixels here. Some people consume, their media on small screens. So this is all fantasy. I mean, to use your term. But if you can tell a story that generates an emotional reaction, then I think we've won. We've won as storytellers and as game devs.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the idea that kind of all of these races are basically extrapolations of humans' extremes, right? There has to be something in there where we're like, yeah, I can kind of understand where they're coming from. But then when you're working with like a purely alien race, like say the Protoss or something like that, you have to kind of take a step back even further from that. I mean, when you're working with something that is so distant, does that become the aspect of humanity? Do you understand the fact that it's so much in kind of opposition to what we understand about motivation?
Well, what we found is that we tell human stories, even if that human is an orc or an alien. We're always telling human stories, and I feel that they can transcend, boundaries of POVs. Right? What does it mean to exist? Doesn't matter if you're a psychic alien with no mouth or a human being. There's certain common elements of existence: loss, hope, love, betrayal. And those themes are the ones that we love playing with.
So with a lot of the games that Blizzard makes are games as a service now. They're constantly evolving. The storyline's never static, and to a certain extent, never really finished. I mean, that's obviously gives you a lot of kind of leeway to work in different directions. You've got very, very passionate fans playing it. You've got people who are really, really, really into all the lore. They read every word, and a lot of them are pretty vocal, right? You get a lot of feedback. I mean, to what extent does some of that feedback change the way that a story evolves? If you've got an expansion coming out for WoW, say, and you pretty much know where the story is going to end, do you ever kind of begin to make changes in that, or think about future expansions differently because of the ways that people are reacting once it's live?
I think it varies game by game and project by project, and specifically with WoW, our creative director, Alex, said a wonderful thing. He said that our story rooms are our dojos. These are kind of like sacred places. and we try to tell the stories as best we can and to make our players as happy as we can, but we try not to let the negativity enter the dojo, right? You kind of clear your mind, focus your mind, and do good work. So do we listen to our players and our fans? Absolutely. But also we try not to let that distract us from our end goal of, the expansion or, the new patch, etc. We have a plan, we are listening, but also, those voices can get pretty loud out there sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that Blizzard's really kind of pioneered in some ways is this a lot of diversity and representation of stuff, and it seems to be very important to you and the team, and I know that's kind of reflected in the formation of the team as well. How did that movement begin within the company? Was that just the expression of internal voices? Was that the recognition of needs from an audience?
Well, it definitely began before I started. And I think Overwatch is one of the physical manifestations of that. And I remember Jeff Kaplan, during one of his interviews, this was before I joined the company, was saying how that his hope is that everyone can hopefully see something within Overwatch that resonates with them, whether it's a story or a character or a backstory. And I thought that was awesome. Like that really made me excited to be part of the company. And then also, internally, as storytellers, we are crafting narrative now for a global audience, and our team needs to reflect that. So, our team comp, we have people with various backgrounds, various POVs, and I really, really love that in our rooms, that it's not all one voice, and we're not all one people, right? I found that sometimes that can be challenging when you're trying to land a story, but also it makes the story that much better. We don't have yes men and yes women in our story rooms, right? It's more like, no, can we make it better? Or no, I need to challenge that. So I found that to be, it definitely keeps us all on our toes, but it makes the story that much better. And again, we're speaking to global audiences, and I'm so excited to see, more female gamers. I'm excited to see more voices and more POVs, both playing our games and also making our games.
It's interesting with Overwatch that it has a very kind of vocal female audience. Do you think that these women were out there playing shooters already, but weren't speaking up, and that Overwatch has kind of allowed them to express their fandom, or do you think that it's created a new audience for?
I honestly don't know. I'd be curious to know the answer to that question. I do know that we've spoken to some of our female fans, and they say that some of them just interact in different ways with our IP. Some fans will just watch the animated shorts and read the comics, and that's how they interact with Overwatch. Others are just play the game. So I'm happy to see that we've reached new, different audiences in different ways, and we're going to continue to try to do that.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's the idea that people might be consuming some of the media that's branched off it, rather than actually playing what we would consider to be the kind of progenitor of it all. I mean, is transmedia? It's obviously a big part of Blizzard's strategy in supporting its games, and we see things with like the Duncan Jones World of Warcraft film, but it's obviously been something you're investing in. Is it part of your future plans?
Our plans in transmedia, and I know it's become kind of a bad word, are evolving, and what I can speak to is that my team is doing a lot in comics and novels and the animated shorts and even audio dramas. So these are things that we're aggressively doing, and they've already been out there, and you've seen them. And I think the recent Warcraft novel, it's a few months old now, but it hit the New York Times bestseller list, so we're very proud of that. And our comics, some of them we just give to our fans free, and you can download them. And sometimes we do bind up graphic novels, and those are doing really well. So absolutely, we are doing transmedia, and we're going to keep doing it.
Cool. I think we had an interesting discussion the other night, being of, I think, a similar generation of people who played games that required a great deal of imagination to kind of bring those worlds to life. And particularly, we talked about shared love of D&D and tabletop games, and the fact that those enabled you to build your own worlds around a kind of very bare bones framework, but that also requires a lot of effort, right? So now when you're producing these games which have very distinct graphical representation, they have all of the lore filled in, there's kind of pretty much any kind of aspect of the story you can think about is already right there for you. Obviously that's nice that for people who just want to absorb it, but it does take away a little bit of that kind of active participation in it, right? Did you think that there's a kind of aspect that's missing from modern media now it's kind of filled in those gaps?
Well, it's interesting, as we were talking about the other day, I feel that you have many choices now, right? And the more that video games craft worlds for you, I think there's a part of all of us that want to make our own worlds, that want to tell our own stories. And, in certain games you can do that. I believe WoW allows you to do that, with your groups and your clans and your raiding and all of that. But I've noticed, especially in the game dev circles that I kind of work in, that every once in a while we like to do theater of the mind stuff, when we play games together. And I think that's that release. It's that, that hex grid on the table, or just a chat about, asking the question, what if, right? And which is an immensely powerful question, especially for storytellers and game devs, when you set aside everything else and say, what if? Let's not worry about anything else. Let's just tell an interesting story. So I feel at least, for game devs who have to support a major IP, that's a wonderful creative outlet and stress relief. And I think that's where a lot of our ideas come from, is taking a break, walking into the woods and seeing, if the muse will strike.
Yeah. Do you ever, working with such well-established worlds that have, pretty serious rules about canon and guidance, do you ever kind of want to experiment with some of the tricks that TV and film use when they want to shake things up a bit, doing a bottle episode or a dream episode, or just some kind of weird alternative future episode that you can just retcon at the end by having someone wake up out of a coma or something, where you can just really play with everything and turn it on its head?
Well, we have certain games where we actually do that a little bit, like Hearthstone doesn't take itself as seriously, and you've probably seen that with a few of our expansions. Some of our comics allow us to do a few things like that. So that outlet is there, and we do kind of take the path less traveled every once in a while. But at the end of the day, you do have these kind of like franchise plans and guidelines, and you kind of have to stick to them. And that's not a bad thing. It kind of helps align us, and we get to tell these grand mythic stories that take years and are conveyed to our players through a series of patches. So that's super exciting. Coming from episodic TV, that really resonates with me. And also, I never had that much runway in TV. Usually you would get 2 seasons and you're canceled, whereas WoW has been going on for years and years, and that's a wonderful story that we get to keep telling.
When you're working on something like WoW, and you have these characters who have evolved over the history of the entire game, who've become figureheads, standing for so much, how do you deal with the handling of that personality? Do you assign like individual writers to individual characters to make sure that they have a kind of continuation of who they are, or is it more of a case of everyone pitching in and having a kind of a group idea of who that character might be?
Certainly. So Alex, our creative director, usually has something in mind of where he wants to go with the characters, and then the WoW team as well. So we would get into a room and kind of break story together with these rough guidelines in place. And then every once in a while, one of my team members would get passionate about something, and we would pitch them back and say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if? this character could do this, or we could evolve this plot line, or remember that quest that kind of just faded away? We'd like to bring that back and add to it. So it's a very positive, collaborative process that seems to kind of feed the engine. A wonderful thing at Blizzard that I really enjoy is when you walk into a room and your pitch lands and the other side of the conversation gets hyped, and then they take up the torch and then they start to set the fires, and you're like, oh, okay, so this is a thing now, we're gonna make this. That's always super satisfying.
Is there a bit of a temptation to get a little bit territorial about some of that stuff, though, right? If you're going, no, hang on, this is my arc, or this is my thread of stuff, and you're not going to touch it because I know how it ends, and don't mess it up.
No, something that we have really taken to heart is not being precious about anything, right? At the end of the day, we serve at the pleasure of the game teams, right? And often they have to change story and character for gameplay reasons, and we totally respect and understand that. So generally, we never have those sort of situations. It's much more of a collaborative process, and vice versa. What I found is that sometimes you pitch something to game team and they go, you know what, you're right. I'm gonna go talk to the dev team and I'm gonna change that. And you're like, whoa, okay, that usually doesn't happen. So that another aspect that really jazzes my team and myself. That if the idea, the best idea wins, right? Doesn't matter where it comes from.
Yeah. How do you track whether a story is landing and whether people are following it? I mean, I know it must be immensely frustrating to kind of put all this work into stuff and know that 20, 30, 50% of the people are just mashing A to get past stuff or jumping out of every cutscene. How do you track that? Are there metrics? Is there ways of telling how long a dialogue box has been on screen, or how many people have watched a cutscene to the end?
I would imagine there's a way to measure that. I am not privy to those numbers, but the feedback that we get, like everyone else, Reddit. And we can measure the numbers on our cinematic shorts. Obviously, they're on YouTube, they're on our site, and that gives us a good feeling of like what seems to be landing, what's resonating with our player base.
For people who wanted to get into narrative design for games, it's an intimidating thing. It certainly feels like there's advantages to having a background in games or an understanding of the way that games work, the way that branching narrative might work. What do you think are the best skills for somebody to try and pick up early in their life, or things they can just be practicing on their own in order to prepare for a career in game narrative?
Certainly. So two lessons that one seems very well. They're both very obvious, but when it comes to writing of any kind. There was a professor that told me a long time ago, writers write. Don't talk, don't think about it, write. And I didn't take his advice for a long time. I did what most writers do, is I didn't write. I talked, I thought about it. Eventually I'll put it down on paper. So, and to expand on that, craft, create, communicate. And then, again, this sounds very trite, but play all the games. Play them all. Play as many games as you can. Video games, tabletop, RPGs, etc. The more you play, the more you realize that there are common aspects of design, narrative design, communicating through game, flow, patterns, and some of it, becomes almost a subconscious language. We talked about this, that you use when you communicate via video games or any form of narrative. So, craft, create, and play.
Well, thank you, George. We've got time for a few questions from the audience. We do have to finish pretty sharply on time this morning, but we have got time for a few questions, I think about 10 or 15 minutes. I think there should be a mic that will go around if anyone's got anything to ask. So anyone have any questions? No one at all. Come on, you can't be that hungover. There's one over here.
It's pretty early.
Do we have a spare mic? Yep, someone coming over.
Yeah, sure. Hi, first of all, thank you a lot for Megas XLR because that's like
My
the
man.
cartoon that shaped me from like Cartoon Network series and everything. But really, my question is more about D&D. And the question is, do you know about Critical Role?
I'm sorry, could you repeat? Do I know?
Do you know about Critical Role?
Oh yeah, certainly. It's funny you mentioned that. My friend and one of the people that I play D&D with regularly, Chris Pinowski, is the head of the studio that's going to do the animated series. So yeah, I know those folks pretty well.
Yeah, that's just what I have to ask. Like your thoughts on the animated series and how that aspect implies to players because their Kickstarter is just based on their fan base.
Their games, yeah.
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 So what are your thoughts about that? I just wondered.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I'm very excited. I know a lot of those folks. Matt Mercer, who is the DM, is the voice of McCree for Overwatch, so there's a lot of overlap. I love those folks. I'm so excited for them. I'm also excited for the future and the fact that we have now an animated series that's been funded that's based on a bunch of people sitting in a room doing funny voices, you know. So like I can't wait to see more and more of this. I want animated series for all the games, right? Like for the games that I love, for the games that you love, for the games that I work on and have worked on. I want more of that. And I think I'm speaking for many players in that we, you know, going back to your question, we want to interact with these games in different ways, right? Wouldn't it be great if you play a game and then you jump on Netflix and then you can binge an entire season based on that game? I think we're moving in that direction. And I think this was kind of like a grassroots way of doing that. But the industry has woken up. You know, the Eye of Sauron is upon them. A lot of people are going to be watching what they do with Critical Role. But I think this is the beginning of many animated series coming your way, for better and worse. And I know it's already started on Netflix. Like we had Castlevania, and there's a few other series in development. So I would say it's an exciting time, not only for those folks, but for animation in games and, you know, inspired by games. Thank you.
Hi. Quick question. So I've been working in mobile games for close to 15 years now, and
wow.
also been a long-time fan of Blizzard games, of course. So I have a question concerning narrative in mobile games. What's your take on that, especially following recent announcements that Blizzard is getting more involved in mobile games? I'd be curious to learn what's your take on that, and do you see it as a challenge? Because mobile games have not exactly been very strong in narrative up to this point.
Certainly. I think narrative in mobile is a challenge. And I think as an industry, you know, we're still figuring it out. And I look forward to seeing when that formula is cracked. I don't think we're there yet. Like, I don't know the best way to deliver, you know, narrative on mobile. And, you know, I'm looking to, you know, the indie devs out there, like maybe you guys can help craft it. I do like the fact that mobile allows you to get that quick hit of that IP that you're really into. And I know that, you know, working at different companies with different devs prior to Blizzard, that was always the question. How do we do narrative for mobile? And I know a lot of big companies are still struggling with that. I think we'll figure it out. I don't think there's a magic bullet to it, though. I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error out there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm obviously a really big fan of Overwatch and WoW. So I just wanted to know, when you're designing a narrative for a character that's not an archetype, like not an elf or a dwarf, something that you already have, you know, a background to start on, do you try to find another archetype in a human nature that really fits the mechanics or the look or of the character? So just what is your process behind that when you're designing something seemingly completely original?
Certainly, that's a great question. And the easy answer, and it's going to sound too simple, but this is the truth. There's that old, actor's question that's now a joke, which is what is my motivation, right? That's what an actor asks the director, and that's the question that we ask when we're crafting characters. What is their motivation? What drives them? Because once you know that, you can write to that character, you can craft that character. So we try to find out, and again, it sounds very simple, but it's the key to the storytelling universe is what do they want, and then what you do is you throw every obstacle you possibly can in their way, and that equals a story. So I just gave you the magic formula. There it is.
Anybody else? It's down here at the front.
Good morning. With a Warcraft question, how do you decide what aspects of the story you put in the animated shorts before a add-on or a patch, and what do you actually try to tell inside of the game with gameplay or the cinematics in there?
Wonderful question. And it's an ongoing conversation that we have with the game devs. Sometimes they will come to us and say, hey, we need a cinematic for this patch, right? Or we cannot convey this story in gameplay, can we do an animated piece? And vice versa. We say to them, so we have this pitch for an animated piece or a comic book. Can we work in a side quest that'll support this character? Can you help us introduce this? So it's really an organic, collaborative process. I know they use the word a lot, collaboration, but it really is very important to us that we don't do any grand reveals, that we don't silo up. We're in constant communication, especially with the WoW team. And every team, we have multiple check-ins every week. And one of my philosophies that I've brought into the story rooms is align early and align often. Show rough work. Constantly communicate. Constantly ask questions. And I feel that is the best route to both in-game design as well as the narrative pieces.
I think there was another question in the middle there.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. It's great.
Absolutely.
I just wondered, is there a tie-in with your group and like any concept artists? Like, is there any sort of pre-visualization that's going on at the, just sort of like scratching out a rough storyboard, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. No. Another great question. Sorry, I should have kind of broken down our team. So I work in the story and franchise development team, and our story group encompasses concept art. We have character designers, we have prop designers, we have storyboard artists, we have writers, we have directors, we have previs artists, we have our lore team, and in the best case, we're all in one room together. And some of the best moments in our animated pieces actually came when we would be sitting there jamming, and you turn around, and one of our storyboard artists is like, "How about this?" And you're like, "Oh my God, that's the moment. We're going to craft it all around that." So that, coming from animation, that's how I used to jam. So I find that, really exciting and wonderful. And we have this extremely talented storyboard artist, Mike Kozumi. And he is a joy because he just sits there quietly, sketching away, listening to us, us writers and directors just prattle on. And then he boarded out an entire scene, and you're like, what? This is, yes, exactly. And I think in general, human beings are very visual people. Like, it's a lot easier to communicate visually than, for me to write a script and I email it out, no one's gonna read that. I mean, they don't have time for that. But if you sit them all in a room and show them a wonderful animatic or storyboard, it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. So yeah, we have this wonderful team of artists, writers, directors, designers, producers, and we have the joy to be able to jam all day, and it's kind of wonderful and exhausting in that every hour is another team, right? So, you know, 1 hour you're jamming with the WoW team on a patch, and the next you're jamming with the Overwatch team for a comic book, and the next you're jamming with StarCraft on a novel. So that's great, but at the end of the day, you're so kind of creatively exhausted. But the next day, you're right back at it, and you're so excited because you're like, all right, I'm going to look at some concept art now, or we're going to look at an animatic, or we're going to look at a galley for the novel. So as a story nerd, as a creative person, as a game nerd, it's kind of awesome. It's a lot of fun. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question. Apologies.
Any more? Just in the middle here.
Hi. Do you ever have like a backup stories that you maybe came up with and they didn't work for whatever reason, and that you shelf them, and maybe when you're in a crunch or something, you can go, oh yeah, we had it, that didn't work last time, but maybe we can adjust it for the future patch, or maybe from another story that just didn't work the way you wanted to?
Yes and no. Usually if the story doesn't work initially, there's something wrong with it, right? You know. But what I've found is that sometimes aspects of that story or that one character was very interesting, we just couldn't land it at the time. And we have producers in the room that take amazing notes. And we find that often, especially our lead producer, will bring those moments up and say, hey, we couldn't do this in this particular patch, but what if? Again, that magical word, what if? Or phrase. So the answer is yes and no. And sometimes we let things die. They're just not good. And we have this phrase in our story rooms, safe room, right? For the longest time, we'd waste all this time by going like, okay, forgive me, this is a terrible pitch, but here's the pitch, right? So I kept kind of bringing the philosophy of a writer's room, TV writer's room, where it's a safe room. It's okay. Give us what you think is a bad pitch, because it may be an amazing pitch, or it may springboard us to an even better pitch. So there's a lot of bad ideas, quote, that get thrown out in the room that can sometimes be mined to find amazing ideas. And the fact that you feel free and supported in those rooms, I've had some amazing ideas come out, and you often have a concept artist or a storyboard artist who will sit in the back and just quietly like raise their hand, what if? And you're like, oh my, yes, absolutely. I have all these writers and directors here who should have thought of that, but I'm so glad that you did. Again, because it is a safe room, and it's okay to throw out, bad ideas, which are never bad.
Yeah. Here you go.
Hi, so I want to chip into the thanks pot for this talk. And I wanted to ask you, because you said as a writer, you should write. But you're never sending your script because no one would read it. So how do you communicate your ideas, your scripts, and then how do you distribute the work from your script and your idea to actually implementing it? Do you have like team of narrative designers who only implement it, or you implement it yourself? How does it work?
Certainly. So when I said no one reads it, I was kind of joking, just because our days are kind of crazy, and you only read the scripts at night, at home. But how we implement it, it really depends on the product and the team. But mainly for our internal team, we have our team of writers, and we break the story together, and we kind of rough out the beats. They write the scripts. We then actually have table reads, much like TV episodes, with the game team. They give us feedback. We do revisions, and then depending on what it is, if it's an animated piece, we go into storyboards, and then storyboards are then cut together, edited. Sometimes we add music and sound effects, and that's an animatic. We present that, and then we go from there. If it's a comic book, we do something similar in that we go into rough panels and we present that. So we're constantly presenting things, but the very first step is beats and then a script. So that's the key to communicating internally with our teams. And then maybe if you're asking about how to get your stuff read, outside of game development, how to evolve as a writer. I've found that having the ability to open yourself up to feedback is very important. Again, something that I learned only later in my career is you have to put your work out there. You can't just keep it to yourself. You can't protect yourself. You actually have to open yourself. You have to be vulnerable. You have to get feedback. And that's what makes you a great writer. So find a writer's group. Find people you trust to give you honest feedback. And that will help you immensely because I'll speak for myself. In my mind, I'm an amazing writer. And then you write something and you deliver it and you're like, oh, I'm terrible. This is awful, right? But after you keep doing that for years and years, you actually do get better. So I believe that might have been part of the question.
So we're down to 5 minutes, so I think we've got time for probably one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
All right, then hopefully a quick one. I'm just curious, how do you know, given the limited attention of the audience playing the games, how do you decide how much of the story actually gets into the game, and how much does it, get cut down the road while writing it?
Yeah, it's there's no easy answer, and it's an ongoing conversation. That's something that we find out with the game team. We find out what can fit where, and then we adjust. We have, as everyone else, we have deadlines, we have limitations, we have budgets, and as a creative team and as a dev team, we're always pushing against all of that, right? But eventually you have to ship, or eventually you're told by a producer you can't. But we team up, If we can't get it in an animated piece, sometimes we sneak it into a side quest, right? Or a comic book, etc. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Cool. All right, well, I think that's about all we've got time for this morning, I'm afraid. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, George.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.